Okay, this is the second half of the paper on corruption and Indonesian education, and I'm still talking about corruption in general and then specifically the effect of greed in the U.S. So I'm going to start with greed in the institutionalized church and business, and then I'll go on to Indonesia. Business, besides schools and after school activities of various sorts, most American families attend a church. In a nation governed by greed, unfortunately, the church as a social institution is also corrupt. The only difference is that this institution is even more hypocritical than other institutions because all major religious traditions condemn greed and abuse of other human beings. All of them teach that human life is sacred and should not be lived with the goal of accumulating wealth. Again, middle class parents who are just trying to fit in, to provide their children with a normal childhood, will join a church and will be asked to contribute to the survival of the institution. In the U.S., the institutionalized church has become even more corrupted by greed than it was before. Even before 9/11, citizens were more segregated by race, ethnicity, and class on Sunday morning or during their time of worship than any other time of the week. At school and at work, at least until recently, citizens mingled with members of other races and classes. Um, Now, class segregation is growing in every social venue. The church has gotten much worse. After 9/11, instead of reflecting on the horrible greed-driven image of our society that's being projected into living rooms all over the world, and the terrible effects that image has in creating envy and resentment of all sorts, expressed in one was expressed in one relatively small way by the attack on September 11th. Americans have chosen to fight back, to take revenge by attacking, and to build mega churches to show the world that God loves us more because he blesses us with more wealth. This only makes the problem worse, as is clear from over 3,000 stories in the Christian Bible that condemn greed and multiple stories in the Koran and in every sacred book ever written. Since the megachurches were built, Americans have become more and more segregated by class when they go to church. The churches were paid for by taking out loans. Churches also are living on debt. Church leaders can appeal to the power of guilt to get members to give. The wealthy can use their church membership as a way to gain the trust of their customers and to network with their peers on Sunday morning, planning business projects and other ways to run their companies better and increase their profits. Ministers who try to speak out against greed have to do so at the risk of offending rich parishioners who will leave or reduce their donations. Preachers are enslaved to the system. Some resent the way they've been silenced. Others embrace their newfound wealth and power and pander to those who provide it, convincing themselves that as long as the money goes to a church, it's not corrupt or serving corrupt ends. Since 9/11, Americans have become more and more polarized by their religious beliefs. This polarization has poisoned all of public life, leading to a greater dislike for paying taxes and try and relieve an unstable and toxic social and political sphere. Instead, religious leaders encourage people to vote against taxation and to give their money to churches instead. Churches set up their own schools, sports teams, summer camps, and even stores with consumer goods. Citizenship is reduced as a way to identify oneself. One's religious denomination becomes a more important aspect of one's identity. Religions are divided into tribes, while citizenship, as people coming together under a body of laws, is degraded. Churches and their parishioners have even changed our nation's laws so that churches can exist more independently from the political sphere in general. This leads to segregation by race, sex, class, and ethnicity, along with segregation based on religious, philosophical, and political ideas and ideals. The nation is being torn apart, all in the name of following God's will and rejecting the so-called secular realm of the political arena. As I have indicated above, the way political life was defined by our founding fathers was incorrect. Churches have good reasons to reject rugged secular individualism. This model is the antithesis of the way religions describe human nature and the kinds of communities and relationships we should be forming. But replacing the individualism of our Declaration of Independence with religious traditions that promote religious intolerance, demonization of members of non-Christian, even non-Protestant religious traditions, demonizing every kind of humanism, and everyone who does not belong to our tribe, is a return to a tribal mentality and all of the problems it brings. Churches create their own rules and laws, but do not take care that their parishioners also respect the political arena, its laws, and the relationships it depends upon for preserving a high quality of political life. Business leaders begin to hire people based on their religious denomination or hire fellow church members. The religious denominations that are currently gaining members are allowed to and even advocate discrimination based on religious beliefs, a practice our founding fathers abhorred, even if it was practiced at the time of our founding. The destabilization of our society and the degradation of the public arena are deliberately chosen in the name of God's will. They are not called corruption. Indonesians also have the problem of having a vast majority of their citizens belonging to one religious tradition, leaving open the possibility of favoring one's own religious tribe when hiring or distributing government contracts, etc. This problem might even be more difficult for Indonesians, not because Muslims are less tolerant, but because they are in the great majority. The United States is more diverse religiously, making it less likely that someone will be discriminated against. For example, if a Muslim Indonesian advertises a job opening, he or she is likely to find a candidate that's both qualified and Muslim. Yet the possible candidate should not be chosen on the basis of their religious association. If an American is hiring for a job, it is much less likely that the best candidate, or even a qualified candidate, will be from their same religious or anti-religious tradition. The hiring process, then, has not become grossly corrupted by religious discrimination, even though other areas of life are much more susceptible to this kind of corruption. I certainly hope that children can grow up knowing what a precious gift it is to live in a society that provides the freedom necessary to engage in intellectual inquiry of any sort, have any or one of many religious affiliations, get the training necessary to get a job one wants, and have good reasons to think they will get the job if there's an opening, be provided with basic physical needs, be protected from violence from others, both citizens and attacks from other nations, etc. These freedoms and securities are not a given, even if a child grows up with them. They can always be lost. Citizens must realize how precious and frail such protections and opportunities are, and what they must do to preserve them. They must avoid corruption of all sorts, realizing that if everyone abused their power, they would lose so much of what makes their lives worth living. Since protection and equal opportunity under the law are the greatest gift we are born with, a deeply embedded appreciation of this kind of association and a complete understanding of how adults must behave in all aspects of their lives in order to preserve it must be the foundation and the goal of the entire educational system. Directly or indirectly, the value of political association must be promoted as a great gift from God, the gift of showing our love for God, or the universe, by creating and sustaining the kind of political culture where all citizens and everyone in the world can thrive. We owe this kind of association to ourselves, to each other, and to the universe, or God. Service to our fellows via our behavior as citizens must be taught as one of the criteria from which any God who is portrayed as judging us after death will, in fact, judge us. Students educated in schools that advocate such religious beliefs must be taught to associate the judgments of their idea of God with the political treatment of other human beings. Greed and the healthcare system. Our system of healthcare has become a system of sick care. The only way many healthcare providers today can keep their jobs is to convince other healthy people that they're sick, or they could be happier or healthier. No one makes money on someone who's healthy and knows how to keep themselves healthy in body, mind, and spirit. The federal government spends very little for preventative health programs. Americans are misinformed. Their habits are getting worse and worse. Doctors convince parents that their children need various health care products that children have never needed before. Counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists all try to sell anxious parents their services. Apparently today, either adolescence is more difficult than it's been in the past, or else these peddlers have a way of providing drugs or services that can prevent their children from suffering the kind of suffering all human beings have had to live through in the past. When parents are on private health care programs and the programs pay for such services, everyone else has to pay also, even if they do not accept the existence of such health care products. Dentists try to convince parents their children should get braces at age 10 before their mouths have been formed, and they know if their teeth will be straight when they are adults. They claim that they need braces for cosmetic reasons so they can have straight teeth at age 11 to 13. The cost is huge. A growing number of American workers have jobs providing pseudo-health care of all sorts. A growing number of those services are being given to older and older patients who are on government-funded health care programs. Corruption in the business sector of society. Every job in the world is directly or indirectly connected to the business world. Education should not be corrupted by business, but also has to provide the education and training necessary for graduates to succeed financially. No one can or ought to consider themselves completely detached from business and the need to make money to survive. In a healthy society, the purpose of business is to create and distribute goods and services that meet authentic, natural human needs. Advertising should simply inform people of the facts about a product so they can consume intelligently. The particular relationships that exist in the business world are those between business owners and employees, owners and customers, and employees and customers. When a society is corrupted by greed, the business sector no longer serves its natural function. Rather, it is designed to trigger irrational and excessive desires in citizens so they will buy the goods and services that exist because of those irrational desires. The economy of a corrupt nation is sustained by products that deliberately appeal to pride, greed, vanity, envy, gluttony, lust, sloth, and many other irrational desires that destroy both the consumers who buy them and the stability of the society they live in. These emotions pull people apart. They undermine goodwill and trust. They make citizens competitors in a race for who can have the most unnecessary goods. The business world has a great deal of power because when citizens want to show their fellow citizens they're successful in life because they have excess wealth, it's very easy to buy material goods that everyone else can see. Being successful as an excellent teacher, doctor, or other kind of professional is based on the quality of one's relationships and on what powers of soul a professional has implanted in students, clients, or patients. A doctor who succeeds at inspiring patients to eat well and exercise, leading to less sickness, cannot make this evident to others. Such doctors get paid less than those who specialize in heart disease or diabetes. diseases that depend on bad habits, and even promote them in order to keep one's job and to increase the demand, leading to more status and wealth. Doctors who flaunt their wealth as a sign of success are most likely pandering to and increasing sick care, that is, ignoring the ways citizens make themselves sick and then playing the hero by healing them in their own self-caused distress. Professors who teach in academic disciplines that have been shown to lead to higher salaries for their graduates are paid more. Those who focus on disciplines that do not lead to high salaries are the lowest on the pay scale. The list goes on and on. In a greed-driven society, the desire for wealth leads to the corruption of every profession. Professionals promote the reverse of what they're supposed to promote and get paid more for doing so. Further, at the moment, very, very few working adults get rewarded for conserving natural resources and teaching others how to do so, even when it is so clear to everyone that our environment has been degraded to the point of our collective self-destruction. The international economic system cannot grow unless natural resources are being used up at an unsustainable and faster rate. This will lead to more and more wars and conflicts for such resources, and to the continued pollution of our water and air and the depletion of all of our natural resources. Using our professional status and power in ways that force us to abuse the earth is one kind of corruption and exploitation. Because the business world exists in order to meet everyone's need to survive, all relationships can be exploited. Those with power can easily abuse it because the powerless must obey, or they will experience serious hardship. Exploitation and corruption occur at many levels, but they can be categorized to some extent. Owners exploit workers by making their salaries too low, setting up working conditions that are unhealthy and dangerous, refusing to allow unions or other ways that workers can negotiate contracts and go on strike to put pressure on owners to compromise. They can refuse to give workers paid leave when they get sick, extending the workday without renegotiating a contract, refusing to provide a retirement pension, disability insurance, or health insurance, and many other ways that create animosity between the rich and poor and destabilize all aspects of cultural life. Owners exploit customers when they create advertising that's deceptive or that promotes an unsustainable, materialistic image of the good life, leading citizens to judge themselves and others as successful on the basis of how rich they are, undermining the quality of social life. Advertisements can be deceptive or even false. Owners may offer products and services that are dangerous, that do not work as they're supposed to, or that stop working quickly. This leads to more consumption, but it undermines a society. Owners also corrupt the political process by paying for political campaigns and then, when their candidates win, forcing them to pass laws or not pass laws that serve only the interest of the richest at the expense of everyone else. When citizens notice the corruption, political advertising or other commercial outlets can promote the hatred of all politicians and political association, leading to the takeover of social life by business and degrading the higher purpose of citizens living together under a body of laws to promote a higher quality of life. The corruption of the business sector leads to the law of the jungle, a dog-eat-dog world of animosity and competition that makes everyone fearful of their future and suspicious of their fellow citizens. People with government positions can be corrupted in many ways. Those who are in charge of local security, the police, can turn their powers onto their own citizens, punishing some more than others, threatening and intimidating citizens according to their own private interests, all in the name of security. Those in charge of national security, the military, can promote their own interests by threatening other nations, and then when those nations begin to build up their own military, use such a buildup to get voters to accept more money going to the military and less to the quality of life. Once again, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, because the rich can afford private education, health care, transportation, etc., while everyone else is left to suffer. Those in charge of the rule of law, lawmakers and judges, can vote for salaries that are too high, showing they're using their power to enrich themselves rather than to help the middle class and poor. They can approve of publicly funded projects that are not in the nation's long-term interest, simply because their friends run the companies that provide the goods or services they have approved. They can then give government contracts to their friends, sometimes secretly, sometimes openly, but with the claim that the companies their friends run are the most qualified to do the work. When the work is being done, such businessmen cannot be adequately monitored, leading to excessively high salaries and a lower quality of whatever project has been determined necessary. Corruption causes police to avoid arresting their friends. If they're arrested, the public prosecutor assigned is incompetent or paid to present an inadequate case to the judge or jury. Corrupt judges do not enforce equal protection under the law, and instead favor their friends, giving them lighter sentences. Political campaigns are also corrupted by excess money. In many ways, sometimes the problem is that only the rich can afford to run. Those with less money cannot afford the advertising and travel required to get their message to the public. Political advertising can be false or misleading. It can nurture distrust and oversimplify the political climate by presenting one party or candidate as entirely good and the other as entirely evil. Journalism is corrupted when those who own newspapers decide that maximizing profits requires that journalists cover the most sensationalist stories and the greatest lies and false controversies in political life, because such stories will motivate citizens to buy the paper. Stories that cover long-term trends in the nation, or that give a rational and balanced account of both sides of an issue, take an effort to read. These are the most important things to know about political life, yet when too many citizens are too uneducated or too lazy to read them and develop a sophisticated idea of all the dimensions and complexities of political life, newspaper owners may decide they cannot afford to inform citizens and instead just provide short-term, sensationalistic, relatively unimportant bits and pieces of information that citizens notice and like to talk to each other about, leading to an entirely false and trivial idea of what it means to be informed about political life. A model of anti-corruption education. The next section of this paper will discuss most of the virtues described by Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics, and why all children in any society that wants to develop and maintain a society where citizens rule themselves and avoid a takeover of authoritarian leaders must be taught these virtues. This training begins at birth. Children must be trained both in how to behave and in taking pleasure in doing what's virtuous. If children grow up appearing to be virtuous, doing what they're told or forced to do, but do not take pleasure in such actions, they will reject this way of life as teenagers and will live out their adult lives in pursuit of an irrational goal. Ethics education is an education for moral character. Moral character is deeply rooted. A good person not only performs virtuous and just actions, but does so for the right reason, in the right way, at the right time, and because the actions are virtuous and just, and for no other ulterior motive. Such people do not depend on external rewards or punishments, or on public approval or disapproval. In a healthy society, such people will be common and will be recognized and respected. But many societies are not good, and many good people are not recognized publicly for many reasons. Those who love virtue are indifferent to the accidental circumstances that distort their public image. They just continue to live excellently because they cannot live with themselves. They cannot be happy unless they do what they think is best, and also continually try to develop their ideas of good and evil, so that they do not make a bad choice, even though they have good intentions. They not only desire to live well, they seek out continually education so that they have some skill at knowing how to live well in the many, many kinds of situations adults have to face. The first qualification for training a child well is to have good role models, not only parents, but neighbors, teachers, religious leaders, and all adults a child has contact with need to be showing them that they are virtuous and enjoy being virtuous. Aristotle then defines and describes the virtues in approximately the order that children develop them. In each case, the virtue is a middle position between two extremes, excess and defect. In each case, a virtuous person exercises the virtue in a particular situation and does the right thing in the right way at the right time and for the right reason, because it's the best choice, apart from any consequences or social reaction. And I'm just going to whip through these virtues because I've listed them elsewhere on these videos. Self-control is the virtue in relation to pleasures that come from eating, drinking, and sexual gratification. Monogamy is best because it leads to a stable family and society. Courage is the virtue in relation to situations involving fear. There's lots of different kinds of fear. Generosity is exercised in giving away money, but I also think you could give away time. It builds trust and goodwill between citizens. Rational anger is the ability to show anger for the right reason in the right way. Rational ambition is the ability to find out what one's talents are, to get the necessary training, to find the best job possible, and to exercise one's authority for the well-being of the ruled. Rational pride is the ability to know what's best, what's honorable, to live a life that ought to be publicly honored, but then to put up with not actually being honored as much as one should, but making sure that other people are honored so that people know what kind of life they should aspire to. Sociability is the virtue of being able to put up with small injustices for the sake of overall stability. Self-knowledge is the highest virtue. It's the ability to evaluate oneself and one's character as a whole, avoiding being self-deprecating or being boastful and proud. The political virtues are exercised later in life. First of all, knowing how much money one deserves, not being greedy, not being lazy, and spending your money on things that promote human well-being. Legislators are paid to exercise the virtue of the art of legislation, knowing how to make laws that promote the well-being of their societies. The virtue of knowing how to distribute goods and services so that all citizens need is also difficult. This virtue is difficult to figure out how to distribute social goods, but it's important. The virtue of knowing how to apply the laws in cases where a citizen is being punished, and that's the criminal justice system. The virtue of equity is the overall ability to apply laws in particular situations. The ultimate virtue in knowing how to act is called practical wisdom. When faced with a decision, you have to make a choice. So you decide, okay, what's our goal here? What are our options? What's the best option? That would be the object of choice. Then you have to give the right reason for choosing that option. And then you have to be able to convince other people to actually act on what you've decided. People who are good at deliberation also have good judgment. They're good at thinking clearly about how other people live and the other choices people make and why they're better or worse. And also good sense is the ability to forgive people when they make mistakes. Okay, practical wisdom and Indonesia's Pancasila. As all Indonesians know, when their nation was first founded in the 1940s, their founders created a document, Pancasila, that they wanted to serve as a permanent guide for citizens to follow as they began to create and sustain their democratic society. Pancasila has 5 principles. belief in one supreme God, including Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, Confucians, and Christians, both Catholic and Protestant. Number 2, a just and civilized humanity. Number 3, the unity of Indonesia, cultivating trust and goodwill between citizens. Number 4, democracy led by wisdom through deliberation and representation, conversation at the table. And number 5, justice for all Indonesian people, creating the actual institutions for human well-being and then running them well. As a citizen in the U.S., I recognize that this founding document is very different from the founding document of my own nation. The U.S. defines a good government as one that protects the rights of individuals. It does not adequately require that government agents be formed to address our collective needs, not just our individual rights. My founding fathers also carefully separated the belief in God from political life. They experienced centuries of politicians who used the will of God to justify wars and policies that maintained their own power and wealth. Europeans then, and even now, associate any kind of belief in God with an authoritarian and anti-democratic political culture. I think their past history has blinded them to the possibility that religion could be used as a power that unites citizens. Indonesia's founders rejected the Western models for democracy and developed their own, one they thought would lead their own people to becoming citizens who wanted to and knew how to exercise their duties toward each other as citizens. Given the foundation of the belief in God, in some sense, the government has published a document about public education that gives teachers guidance about how to raise their students to integrate a belief in God with all the other aspects of their education. Without quoting from that document, I will offer some suggestions for how to educate Indonesian children to become good Indonesian citizens. From the beginning of their education, Indonesian children should associate belief in God with all of the religions specified in Pancasila. The schools should be very careful that children do not associate God with only one religious tradition. Children are oriented toward what they see and do, so they should be read stories about all the major religious leaders: Confucius, Buddha, Muhammad, Jesus, Moses, etc. A word means nothing to a child. It's just a word unless it's connected to something concrete, something they can understand. Indonesian leaders in the Ministry of Education should work with developmental psychologists and professional educators who will give them informed advice about what kinds of lessons are appropriate at each age if children are expected to internalize the values that all the major religious traditions associate with belief in God or a higher power. Scholars with expertise in these traditions should be consulted to list the stories of the lives of each religious leader and then connect a story with one of Aristotle's virtues. When these connections are made, the stories of Confucius, etc., can be taught at the same time as the stories of Muhammad, so that children know from a young age that the religions teach the same lessons about how to live. Children can be encouraged to make up their own stories of the religious leaders, linking them to the exercise of the virtues. Children should also be asked to exercise those virtues in school and at home. They could write their own stories about moral decisions they've made in their own lives and then connect those experiences with the virtues and the religious leaders. Children must be rewarded for acting virtuously with an eye to getting them to desire to do so, with the goal of having them internalize a great passion for virtue. As they get older, younger people must also be taught about how religion has been used to justify all sorts of vice and injustice, and how it has been abused to cover up corruption. Young people have to learn how to be critical thinkers, learn not to accept society as it appears, and learn to find out what the underlying causes of what they experience really are. Older children need to be asked to imagine themselves in situations that require them to risk job loss or social isolation if they do what is in fact best. They have to anticipate how difficult and complex their adult lives will be. They have to recognize that human life is complicated and that public figures often oversimplify good and evil for their own gain. Young people have to learn the art of compromise and cooperation as the only way to come to a collective decision about what to do that everyone involved will agree on and act on. Children of all ages need to be reminded and shown over and over that evil and vice are ultimately self-destructive. What appears to be best at first will lead them or those they know or their societies in a worse direction. Even though they must choose virtue for its own sake, apart from consequences, they should also know that overall choosing the best or the better of the options is more likely to lead to a brighter future for them and everyone else. These lessons have to be made simpler for young children, but have to become more complex as students grow older. The moral education should never become trivialized or associated with one religious tradition or reduced to simplistic slogans. Young people need to know that many adults think hard about virtue and think they are acting virtuously and still make very bad choices. They need to know that good intentions are not good enough. Belief in God does not mean that everything one does is good as long as one thought it was what God wanted at the time. Rather, belief in God should motivate a person to become serious about how to live out a life for the glory of God that will leave a positive legacy behind for the next generation. Professionals and government leaders should work together on this much more than I can say here. I'm just proposing a way of approaching the activity of educating Indonesian citizens for being good Indonesian citizens. It's important, however, for Indonesians to prove to the world that they can promote the belief in God and, using that, develop a healthy democratic society and a healthy democratic educational system. In the new age we're living in, there are and will continue to be many different kinds of political ideologies that serve as the foundation for democratic societies. Aristotle would have agreed with what the Indonesian founders did. Aristotle thought that there is one best constitution for any one country at any one time. The U.S. Declaration of Independence and Constitution were not the best for Indonesia, given Indonesia's history and culture. Since the Indonesians had been oppressed for centuries by the Dutch, by people who claimed to be democratic, Indonesians had very good reasons not to imitate Western culture in the formation of their own democracy. The Dutch and all colonizers during the modern era justified their oppression with racism, the belief that non-white, non-Western people were inferior by nature and unable to set up and run sophisticated, self-governing societies. Everyone in the world now knows that such racism was wrong, based on self-interest and self-justification. Now the previously colonized nations must do the work of proving the West wrong. It is disappointing, then, to read about corruption among the Indonesian political and economic elite. Although such behavior does not prove Indonesians are incapable of self-rule, it can lead to more exploitation of non-Western nations by Western ones, a new era of colonization, but this time in the name of the free market. Political leaders have to prove to their people they cannot be bribed, either by Indonesian contractors, or by international corporations, or by friends and relatives. Like any other people, Indonesians are able and willing to live under the rule of law. The belief in God in Pancasila must be directly and continually linked to the desire and ability to participate in political life and to exercise political power justly. The nations of the world are interconnected and interdependent. If they truly embrace democratic values, they want all the other nations to succeed at self-governance. They do not want stronger nations to be able to prey on the weaknesses of poorer ones. When this happens, everyone suffers in the long run. When this happens, the advantages that a predatory nation has motivates other nations to become predatory if they can get away with it. Either way of establishing the relations between nations as equals before the rule of international law or as exploiting each other will lead to more and more of those kinds of relationships. Indonesia needs to succeed because all nations need to succeed. Indonesia also needs to succeed to show the world that democratic societies do not have to be based on secular, materialistic, and individualistic principles such as human rights. Democratic nations can be based on the belief in God and the cultivation of a collective consciousness, the continual awareness that all citizens are interconnected and must help each other out, both by paying taxes so that political institutions can be established and run, and by private generosity and goodwill, the desire to develop internal unity, and the desire to engage in serious conversation together to solve the nation's problems. This image is very different from the doctrine of human rights that has been developed by the West, although the United Nations Declaration of Universal Human Rights is different from the U.S. Declaration. There's no reason for Pancasila to fail in principle. Only the corruption of its people could lead to failure. Indonesia also needs to succeed because it's the world's fourth largest nation and because 88% of its citizens are Muslims. A stereotype about Muslims has been perpetuated by 9/11 and persists among people who are determined to be ignorant and self-promoting. Indonesians can give the world an example of how 220 million or so Indonesians can be both pious Muslims who pray 5 times a day and practice fasting during Ramadan, as well as deeply committed to living in a democratic society. They have to show the world that their way of life is what their way of life is based on. The best way to practice Islam is to do so freely, by choice, in a society that gives citizens other options. True Islam, like any other religion, cannot be practiced in a society that forces citizens to be Muslim or suffer discrimination, imprisonment, or death. Whenever societies have forced citizens into claiming to belong to one religious tradition, and demonizing all others, the citizens have been hypocritical or corrupt. They always have ulterior motives for claiming to adhere to the state religion, avoiding discrimination and all other possible threats. Adherents to the official state religion cannot know what their motives really are because they've not been challenged to proclaim them in the face of persecution. Every aspect of culture is corrupted when citizens must adhere to one religion. As an American, I'm particularly interested in the success of Indonesia and its people. My nation is engaged in some sort of war, cultural or terrorist or whatever label politicians give it to promote their own interests, against Islam or against some of the oil-rich Islamist nations. Indonesians need to let Americans especially know that the majority of Muslims throughout the world, a huge percentage of which are Indonesians, are not terrorists. They abhor terrorism, and they reject any interpretation of the Quran or of the teachings and history of Muhammad's life that justifies religious intolerance and violence against others on the basis of religious belief. Within the U.S., intolerant Christians demonize Muslims without knowing about Indonesia or Muslims throughout Southeast Asia and elsewhere who are committed to democracy, interreligious dialogue, and Islam. Americans, then, need Indonesians to take care of the problem of corruption in their society. They need their society to function smoothly so it will survive and thrive as a democracy. Corruption exists in every nation, including the U.S. The U.S. is particularly dependent on the success of Indonesia, however, so I will you all the best, and I thank you for inviting me here.